Today, we're diving into something that often gets lost in the bigger headlines about the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We're going to look at source material that chronicles the complete collapse of what was once one of the best education systems in the entire Middle East.
Okay, so to really get a sense of just how much was lost, you've got to hear this. This quote is from a UNESCO fact sheet. And get this, it's dated right after the invasion began. It says that before all the conflict, Iraq's education system wasn't just, okay. It was a powerhouse in the region.
And this is the core question we're tackling today. How on earth do you go from over 100% primary school enrollment to at least 5 million people being illiterate? It's a staggering drop. And the source material we're digging into tries to explain how it happened, breaking it all down into a few key stages.
So let's just expand on that before picture for a second. The source makes it really clear this wasn't just about kids learning to read and write. We're talking about top-tier higher education, scientific institutions that were up to international standards, staffed by some seriously high-quality people. That's the foundation we're starting with. All right, so the first piece of the puzzle, according to the source, is the physical destruction. And the author argues this wasn't just random chaos from the war. They describe it as something more systematic, a process that just completely took apart the country's educational infrastructure.
Just look at this number, 84%. Let that sink in for a moment. According to a UN report that the source cites, 84% of Iraq's universities and colleges were burned, looted, or just plain destroyed. That's practically a total wipeout of higher learning. And it wasn't just the universities. The damage was everywhere, and it came in all forms. The source lists some shocking numbers. Over 700 primary schools bombed, another 200 burned, more than 3,000 looted. And think about it, that's not just the buildings themselves, it's everything inside. All the books, the computers, the lab gear, gone. And to make things even worse, a lot of the schools still standing were taken over for military use. So, you might be wondering, what was the official thinking behind all this? Well, the source points to this really telling quote from John Agresto. He was the guy put in charge of higher education by the Coalition Provisional Authority. He apparently thought the looting was a positive thing, a way to get a clean slate. The source's author interprets this as a mindset that saw this destruction not as a disaster, but as a chance to rebuild the whole system from scratch, maybe in a way that was more friendly to U.S. policy goals.
But here's the thing, you can rebuild buildings. The next part of the source material gets into something much harder, if not impossible to replace, the human cost. The author argues that this wasn't just collateral damage. They claim it was a targeted campaign against the country's best and brightest, its intellectuals and experts.
And the brain drain was just massive. The source pulls UN figures that estimate by the end of 2006, 40%, nearly half of Iraq's entire middle class had fled the country. We're talking about the doctors, the engineers, the professors, basically the very people you need to run a modern country. They were gone. And for the ones who decided to stay, the danger was very, very real. The source brings up a database from the Brussels Tribunal. It's documented the targeted killings of 467 Iraqi professors and lecturers since 2003. And again, the source material argues these were not random crimes. It claims this was a deliberate campaign. This created a climate of absolute fear that just paralyzed everything. This quote from a teacher back in 2006 really brings it home. They said education was just collapsing because parents were too scared of kidnappings to even send their kids to school. I mean, when you have teachers being killed and students being taken, education just stops. It grinds to a halt. So that brings us to the next layer of this whole crisis. It wasn't just about destroyed buildings and people leaving. The source material talks about a total systemic collapse. And this one was driven by bad policy, power vacuums, and just rampant corruption. So you have to ask, right? Who was actually in charge of all this? In the middle of all that chaos, who was calling the shots for Iraq's entire education system? Well, the source points to people like Andrew Erdman. He was technically a senior advisor, but in reality, he was acting as the Minister of Education. And get this, the author notes he was a 36-year-old historian, didn't speak Arabic, and had zero administrative experience. Yet this was the person in charge of all 22 of the country's university presidents. And according to the source, this kind of leadership vacuum created a total cascade of problems. First, you had the de-Baathification policy. This purge got rid of thousands of experienced professors and administrators almost overnight. Then, the jobs were filled not based on skill, but on political loyalty. Add in widespread corruption and a massive money crunch, and you've got a recipe for disaster.
The source gets really specific about the kinds of corruption that took over. We're talking about allegations of over 30,000 civil servants having fake degrees. Think about that. Then you had contractors they called haramia, which means thieves, who do terrible repair work just so they could pocket the money. And of course, the big one, important jobs going to party loyalists instead of people who actually knew what they were doing. Okay, so after all that, what's the end result? The last section of our source material really looks at the long-term fallout from this collapse and what it means for Iraq's place in the world today. The fall from grace is just, wow. Iraqi universities used to be regional leaders, right? The source notes that by 2011, only 3 of them were in the top 100 in the Arab world. And Baghdad University, which was the crown jewel of the system, wasn't even in the top 12,000 globally. Just a catastrophic decline.
And this all builds up to what is by far the most serious accusation in the source material. The author puts all the pieces together: the destroyed buildings, the exiled and assassinated academics, the corruption, and argues it adds up to something they call cultural cleansing, a deliberate effort to destroy Iraq's human capital and its very identity. And the source is very direct about who it says is responsible. The author contends that when you look at the assassination campaign, the complete lack of any real investigation, and what they describe as documented proof of death squads being created by occupying forces, they argue it all points back to the occupying powers being ultimately accountable for what happened to Iraq's intellectuals. The author wraps up their argument with this incredibly powerful line: silence is complicity, and silence kills. Their point is that the failure of the international community to step in, to investigate, to even appoint someone to look into human rights in Iraq, that this silence made them complicit in the whole tragedy. And that's where we'll leave it. We'll turn the central argument of the source material into a question for you to think about. After seeing all this, what really is the long-term cost? What happens to a country when its intellectual class, its very brain, is systematically dismantled during a conflict?